The stone that should have been steel crumbled between his fingers as the bridge tore itself apart, taking 17 souls into the churning river below, while James Morrison realized with crystalline horror that he'd somehow been thrown back 1,000 years. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. James had been inspecting the new San Francisco Bay Bridge expansion just moments ago, running his hands along the perfectly calculated stress points of modern engineering, when reality twisted. The tablet in his hand flickered and died. The safety harness securing him to the maintenance walkway vanished. The roar of 21st century traffic morphed into something far more terrible, the shriek of splitting timber and the screams of people plummeting into medieval England's most treacherous river. His body moved before his mind could process the impossibility. 25 years of structural engineering had hardwired responses that transcended temporal displacement. The wooden bridge was collapsing in textbook failure. Too much weight on too few supports, no load distribution, joints that transferred stress instead of dispersing it. But academic understanding meant nothing against the immediate human catastrophe. A wagon loaded with grain barrels had triggered the collapse, its weight the final insult to wood that had been slowly rotting for decades. The driver disappeared first, pulled down by his panicking horses. A family of 5 who'd been walking behind the wagon vanished next as planks gave way like dominoed death. Then, the entire center span surrendered to gravity, taking anyone unfortunate enough to be crossing on this crisp October morning. James sprinted along the riverbank, his modern athletic wear somehow transformed into rough wool and leather that chafed with every stride. The water was violent with autumn rains, carrying bodies and debris with equal indifference. A young woman clung to a broken beam, her heavy skirts dragging her under. James dove in without hesitation, the shock of cold water nothing compared to the shock of temporal displacement. She fought him at first, panic making her claw at anything solid. James used lifeguard training from another lifetime, another world, approaching from behind and securing her in a rescue hold. The current was stronger than anything in chlorinated pools, trying to claim them both. He kicked toward shore where others were forming human chains, though their help came with suspicious stares at his foreign features. Back in for a merchant who'd been trapped under his own goods. Again for 2 children who'd managed to grab onto a partially submerged log. Each rescue burned energy James couldn't spare, his body already exhausted from whatever cosmic trauma had brought him here. But he couldn't stop. Not while people were dying from engineering failures that shouldn't exist in any timeline where humans had discovered basic physics. By the time local guards pulled him from his 5th rescue attempt, forcibly restraining him from killing himself to save others, the death toll was final. 17 people had been on the bridge when it failed. James had saved 6. 11 bodies would wash up downstream over the coming days, victims of infrastructure that was criminal in its incompetence. The survivors huddled on the muddy bank like broken dolls, coughing river water and staring at the gap where their only crossing had been. The economic implications were already rippling through gathered crowds. This wasn't just a bridge, it was the lifeline connecting their market town to the wider world. Without it, they were effectively under siege by geography. "Foreign devil brought this curse," someone muttered in Middle English that James understood just enough to be worried. His Asian features stood out like a beacon in this Anglo-Saxon crowd. When trauma needed a target, outsiders made convenient scapegoats. The guards who'd pulled him from the river now viewed him with different eyes. Their captain, a scarred veteran with intelligent eyes, studied James with the careful assessment of someone who'd survived by reading danger. He barked questions in rapid dialect, growing more suspicious when James could only shake his head in incomprehension. They searched him with rough efficiency, finding nothing that made sense to medieval minds. His wallet had become a leather pouch containing a few silver coins. His smartphone was simply gone, along with every other trace of the 21st century. But his clothes were too well made, his body too well fed, his teeth too straight and white. Everything about him screamed, "Doesn't belong." The march through town confirmed James's temporal displacement with brutal sensory clarity. No power lines crossed the sky, no glass-filled windows, just oiled cloth and wooden shutters that did little to keep out the October chill. The smell was overwhelming: human waste, rotting garbage, unwashed bodies, wood smoke, and the distinctive stench of tanneries. This wasn't a Renaissance fair. This was history in all its filthy, dangerous reality. The castle squatted on a hill overlooking the river like a stone toad, all function and no beauty. James's architectural eye automatically cataloged the construction: solid Norman engineering, probably 12th century, with later additions that showed more ambition than skill. Murder holes were positioned correctly, but the drainage was catastrophic. Water damage would bring these walls down faster than any siege engine. They dragged him before the Lord in what passed for a great hall. A smoky, dim space where dogs fought over scraps and torches provided more smoke than light. The Lord himself was younger than James expected, perhaps 30, with the kind of intelligent eyes that had probably kept him alive in a world where leadership meant survival of the smartest as much as the strongest. A priest was summoned to attempt communication. His Latin was ecclesiastical rather than classical, but it was a language James had studied extensively for his architectural history degree. Never had those boring conjugations seemed so vital. "You were at the bridge when it fell," the priest translated. "The guards saw you studying it before the collapse. Explain yourself." James chose his words carefully in his rusty Latin. "I saw the danger. The supports were failing. Wood was rotten where water collected. Weight was distributed incorrectly." He used his hands to illustrate, showing how load should flow versus how it had been concentrated. "I was trying to understand how bad the situation was when it failed." "You claim to be a builder?" The Lord leaned forward, interested despite suspicion. "An architect," James said, then had to explain the concept. "One who designs structures, who understands why buildings stand or fall. From," he paused, "geography being safer than chronology. From eastern lands, trained in Constantinople." It was plausible enough. His Asian features could pass for Byzantine Greek mixed with Eastern trading partners. The claim of distant training explained knowledge local builders lacked. Most importantly, it positioned him as potentially useful rather than merely suspicious. "Draw what you saw," the Lord commanded, gesturing for parchment and charcoal. This was James's element. His hands might shake from adrenaline and temporal shock, but muscle memory of 10,000 technical drawings steadied them. He sketched the failed bridge in elevation and section, marking every point of failure with an architect's precision. Then, beside it, he drew a proper stone arch bridge, complete with force vectors and load distribution patterns. The hall fell silent. The priest stopped breathing. The Lord stood slowly, studying drawings that might as well have been sorcery for all his people understood them. But intelligence recognizes intelligence across any century, and this Lord hadn't survived by being stupid. "Explain these marks," he commanded, pointing at the force arrows. James drew more diagrams, using pictures where Latin failed. He showed how weight created downward force, how that force could be redirected through proper architecture. He illustrated an arch, showing how each stone pressed against its neighbors, creating strength from what would be weakness in isolation. He drew water flowing through multiple arches instead of building catastrophic pressure against single spans. "The Romans built such things," the priest murmured, recognizing classical knowledge even in foreign presentation. "Their bridges still stand after 1,000 years. "Because they understood," James said simply. "Stone and wood have rules. Water has rules. Follow the rules. Structures stand. Ignore them." He gestured toward the river where debris still floated from the morning's disaster. The Lord made his decision with the swift pragmatism that probably characterized all his survival decisions. "Build me a bridge. Prove your knowledge. Succeed, and you'll have my protection and position. Fail." He didn't need to finish. Medieval justice offered limited options for suspected saboteurs, and none of them were pleasant. They gave him a work crew drawn from the town's builders and a test site, a stream that fed into the main river. It was narrow enough for a simple span, but wide enough to require actual engineering. The workers assembled with the enthusiasm of men forced to work with a foreign possible sorcerer who might get them all hanged if his bridge failed like the last one. James studied his resources with professional assessment. The workers were skilled in their fashion. They could cut timber, shape stone, mix mortar, but they had no concept of precision. Everything was done by eye and tradition. Make it like grandfather made it was the extent of their engineering. Philosophy. He started with basic education, using charcoal on flatboards to illustrate principles. The language barrier was frustrating but not insurmountable. Mathematics was universal, and demonstrations spoke louder than words. He showed how a badly balanced board would tip, then how proper support prevented tipping. He demonstrated load distribution using their own bodies, one man trying to lift a heavy stone versus 4 men sharing the weight. The breakthrough came when he used their defensive knowledge as a bridge to engineering concepts. These men understood siege warfare. They knew that concentrated force at one point could breach walls, while distributed force failed. James showed them how bridges failed the same way. Too much force on too few points meant collapse. Spread the load properly, and the bridge became as defensible as a well-built wall. But teaching theory was one thing. Getting medieval workers to execute with precision was another. James created measuring tools from scratch. Standard lengths marked on poles, angles checked with crude triangulation, levels made from water-filled tubes. Each tool had to be explained, demonstrated, and then watched carefully as workers' instincts fought against unnecessary precision. The foundation battle was epic. Local tradition said to build on the firmest ground near the surface. James insisted on digging to bedrock, even if that meant going down 12 feet. The workers grumbled about wasted effort until James demonstrated erosion. He built 2 sample foundations, one shallow, one deep. Then, he diverted stream water to flow past both. The shallow foundation undermined in hours. The deep one stood unchanged. Seeing was believing. Material selection became another educational opportunity. The workers would use any stone that roughly fit. James showed them how different stones weathered differently, how grain direction affected strength, how proper cutting multiplied durability. He established quality standards that seemed obsessive to medieval minds but would prove their worth over centuries. The wooden centering, the temporary framework that would hold archstones until the keystone locked them in place, took 2 weeks to build. Workers who slapped bridges together in days watched in amazement as James measured, adjusted, and measured again. The curve had to be perfect. Each support had to bear exact loads. The entire structure had to be strong enough to hold tons of stone, yet be removable once those stones became self-supporting. Word of the strange foreign builder spread through the countryside. Lords and merchants came to observe, some hoping to steal knowledge, others expecting spectacular failure. James welcomed all observers, teaching openly. He gave impromptu lectures on force and structure, using gestures and demonstrations where words failed. Knowledge hoarded was knowledge that died. Knowledge shared became immortal. The first stones were laid on a cold November morning. James positioned each one personally, checking angles with his handmade tools. The workers had evolved from skeptical to curious to genuinely engaged as they began understanding the principles. Each stone wasn't just a block, it was part of a system, precisely cut to transfer specific forces in specific directions. As the arch rose from both banks, meeting in the middle where the keystone waited, tension grew among observers. Everyone knew this moment, when wooden support gave way to stone reality. Most medieval bridges stood or fell in this transition. The foreign builders' drawings were impressive, but stone cared nothing for theory if practice failed. James placed the keystone himself, tapping it home with careful strikes that seated it perfectly between its neighbors. The moment of truth had arrived. Workers began removing the wooden centering, transferring weight from temporary support to permanent structure. The stones ground against each other with sounds that made observers step back, expecting collapse. The arch settled perhaps an inch, stones finding their final positions. Then, silence. The structure stood free, a curve of stone that seemed too delicate to support its own weight, much less traffic. James walked beneath it first, trusting his life to calculations and construction. The arch held with the solidity of bedrock, but demonstration had barely begun. James ordered load testing that made medieval builders blanch. Stones were piled on the bridge, not just a few, but wagon loads that would exceed any practical traffic. The arch didn't budge. He brought the Lord's destrier, a warhorse in full barding, iron shoes ringing on stone as it crossed. The bridge might have been carved from a single stone for all it noticed. The ultimate test was dynamic loading. James had 20 men march across in lockstep, trying to create destructive resonance, then jump in unison at the crown, maximum impact load. The stones remained unmoved, locked in their perfect curve, like they'd been waiting centuries to be assembled correctly. The Lord arrived as planned, bringing his master builder, a traditionalist who'd built wooden bridges for 30 years and watched most rot, burn, or wash away. The old man circled James's creation with the careful hostility of someone whose entire career was being challenged. He pressed stones, examined joints, even crawled beneath to inspect from below. When he emerged, his weathered face showed wonder rather than resentment. Through halting Latin, he asked questions that revealed deep practical knowledge lacking only theoretical framework. Why this specific curve? How were forces calculated? What made this design superior to Roman bridges he'd seen in ruins? James taught eagerly, recognizing a kindred spirit across the centuries. The old builder had intuitive understanding from decades of experience. He just needed the mathematical framework to explain what he'd felt but couldn't, but articulate. Within hours, the master builder had become James's most enthusiastic student and powerful ally. By sunset, the demonstration had transformed into an impromptu engineering school. Builders from 3 counties surrounded James as he drew diagrams, demonstrated principles, answered questions through translation and gesture. The successful test bridge had proven the knowledge worked. Now everyone wanted to understand how. The Lord made his pronouncement before the assembled crowd. James would build the main bridge, not just replacing what had failed, but creating something that would stand for centuries. It would be wider than the old bridge, stronger, proof that knowledge could triumph over tradition. Resources would be unlimited. Timeline would be whatever James required. This bridge would demonstrate the Lord's commitment to progress and prosperity. But success had awakened opposition. The Ferry Guild saw their monopoly threatened by a bridge that wouldn't conveniently collapse every decade. Traditional builders recognized existential threat in methods that made their knowledge obsolete. Even the church worried. Such understanding seemed unnatural, possibly diabolic. How could one foreign man know what generations of Christian builders didn't? Winter arrived before major construction could begin, but James used the forced delay productively. The Lord granted him use of a warehouse near the river, which became medieval England's first engineering school. Students came from across the region, younger sons of nobles seeking useful occupation, ambitious craftsmen wanting advancement, even a few progressive priests interested in divine mathematics. The curriculum started with basics that seemed advanced to medieval minds, arithmetic beyond simple counting, geometry that had practical application, the relationship between angles and strength. James created teaching aids from whatever was available. Wooden models showing force distribution, sand tables for drawing complex diagrams, even a small water channel for demonstrating hydraulic principles. But the most revolutionary aspect was standardization. James introduced consistent measurement units, technical drawing conventions, and mathematical notation that could cross language barriers. A stone cut to specifications in one quarry would fit perfectly with stones from another. Drawings made in England could be understood in France. Knowledge became portable and permanent. The winter months flew by in a blur of teaching and preparation. James refined his bridge design based on detailed site surveys. The main river was 60 feet wide at normal flow, but could triple that during spring floods. The old wooden bridge had been rebuilt 7 times in living memory, each time lasting a shorter period before inevitable failure. James designed for permanence. 3 main arches would span the regular channel, with additional smaller arches on each bank to handle flood overflow. The foundations would go down to bedrock, 20 feet in some places. The piers would have cutwaters to split the current and prevent debris accumulation. This wouldn't just be a bridge, it would be a statement that humans could build forever if they understood how. Spring brought the real challenge. Creating dry workspace in a flowing river pushed medieval technology to its limits. James designed cofferdams using double walls of driven piles with clay packed between. Hand pumps operated by shifts of workers fought constant seepage. It was brutal, dangerous work that claimed 2 lives before James implemented safety procedures that seemed paranoid to medieval minds but would become standard practice. The first foundation took 3 months. James insisted on depth that seemed insane to traditional builders, down through river silt, through gravel, through clay, until they hit solid rock that hadn't moved since England formed. He showed skeptics how scour patterns could undermine shallow foundations, how a bridge that looked solid could be doomed by invisible erosion. What happens next will determine whether 1,000 years of accumulated knowledge can overcome centuries of traditional failure, and remind us why sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply building something right. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Political intrigue intensified as the bridge progressed. Neighboring lords sent spies disguised as workers. The Ferry Guild attempted sabotage, from subtle tool theft to overt arson attempts. A mysterious fire destroyed the timber yard, forcing expensive replacement. Through it all, James maintained focus on the work itself, trusting that success would silence opposition better than any argument. He implemented security measures that seemed extreme but proved necessary. Tools were counted and locked each night. Guards patrolled the construction site. Most importantly, he created redundancy. In knowledge, multiple people understood each critical process. If something happened to James, the bridge could still be completed. The first arch began rising as summer peaked. The massive voussoirs, wedge-shaped stones forming the arch, each weighed over a ton. They had to be cut with precision that challenged the best masons, fitted together with gaps measured in fractions of inches. James had created templates and checking tools, but ultimately it came down to skilled hands guided by understanding minds. The wooden centering for the main arch was a marvel in itself. Traditional builders would have used rough scaffolding. James designed a reusable system that could be adjusted for each arch, saving time and timber. The curve had to be perfect. Too flat and the arch would thrust outward dangerously, too steep and it would be weak at the crown. As stones rose from both banks, the entire town held its breath. This arch was 3 times larger than the test bridge. If it failed, it would kill workers and destroy faith in the new methods. James found himself sleeping at the construction site, checking and rechecking calculations that he knew were correct, but still felt the weight of lives depending on their accuracy. The Keystone ceremony became a regional event. The Lord insisted on placing it himself, demonstrating faith in the project. James stood beside him, calling out the precise strikes needed to seat the massive stone perfectly. The sound it made settling into place, a deep grinding that resonated through the entire structure, would haunt his dreams for years. Then came the terrifying, beautiful moment of removing the centering. Hundreds of people lined both banks to watch. The workers themselves were nervous, despite having seen the principles proven on the test bridge. This was different. This was massive. This was their lives and their town's future, balanced on stone and mathematics. The supports came down incrementally. Each removal shifted load from wood to stone. The arch began to speak. Groans and cracks as forces found their paths. Several observers fled, certain that collapse was imminent. But James heard the voice of stone finding stability, of mathematics becoming reality. When the last support was removed, the arch stood free, a gateway between banks that seemed to float without support. The celebration that night was premature. 2 more main arches remained, plus approach spans and roadway. But the successful first arch had proven that scale didn't compromise principles. The same mathematics that worked for small bridges could create monuments. The revolution wasn't just in technique, but in thinking. Summer turned to autumn with frantic construction pace. The second arch rose faster than the first, workers now confident in methods that had seemed alien months before. The cofferdam techniques improved with practice. Stone cutting became more precise as masons internalized the importance of accuracy. What had been foreign, imposition, was becoming familiar excellence, but nature provided the ultimate test before the bridge could be completed. An early winter storm, The kind that came perhaps twice in a generation, sent floodwaters raging down the valley. Every wooden bridge for 50 miles was swept away. The ferry docks vanished like they'd never existed. James's incomplete bridge, 2 arches finished, 3rd barely started, faced destruction. He'd designed for this possibility, but theory and practice were different creatures when walls of water came crashing down. The floodgates in the cofferdams were opened, letting water through rather than fighting it. The completed arches stood like stone mountains, splitting the current. Most critically, the cutwaters worked perfectly, shedding debris that would have accumulated against flat faces. For 3 days, the storm raged. The Lord's castle itself was threatened as water rose higher than living memory. Traditional infrastructure disappeared like snow in summer. When the floods finally receded, the landscape had been scoured clean of human construction, except for 2 perfect stone arches that stood as if the flood had been a gentle rain. The political implications were staggering. In a single storm, James's methods had proven superiority beyond any argument. Lords who had resisted now begged for his students. Merchants calculated the fortune lost to failed infrastructure versus the investment in permanent solutions. The church, seeing bridges survive where prayer had failed, began discussing the divine geometry in James's designs. But for James, the survival meant something more personal. He'd been ripped from his time, thrown into an age of engineering ignorance, forced to rebuild civilization's infrastructure from scratch. The bridge had become his anchor, proof that knowledge transcended time. Each stone properly placed was a victory against chaos. The 3rd arch rose with winter's end, completing the main span. But James's vision had expanded beyond mere crossing. He designed refuges built into the piers where travelers could shelter, drainage systems that would prevent water damage, even decorative elements, carved keystones and balustrades that would inspire maintenance through pride. As the bridge neared completion, demands for James's expertise multiplied exponentially. A duke wanted aqueducts to supply his castle. A merchant guild needed warehouse designs that could bear previously impossible loads. The king himself had heard of bridges that winter couldn't destroy and summoned James to discuss infrastructure that could unite a kingdom. But James faced a choice that would define not just his legacy, but the pace of progress itself. He could become court engineer, building for the powerful while restricting knowledge to maintain advantage. Or he could democratize engineering, training as many as possible, trusting that shared knowledge would benefit more than hoarded secrets. The bridge's final. Stones were being placed as James made his decision. This wouldn't be his last creation, but his first. The school would expand, standards would be established, knowledge would flow like the water beneath his arches, powerful, unstoppable, and available to all who would learn to channel it properly. The completed bridge stood as more than a river crossing. It was a statement written in stone that human ingenuity could conquer nature's challenges through understanding rather than force. The 3 main arches rose 60 feet at their crowns, high enough for river traffic to pass beneath. The smaller flood arches on either bank would handle the worst storms. The roadway was wide enough for 2 wagons to pass comfortably, with stone refuges every 100 feet where pedestrians could avoid traffic. James insisted on details that seemed excessive to medieval minds, but would ensure centuries of service. The drainage channels were sloped precisely to prevent standing water that could freeze, and crack stone. Iron fixtures were seated in lead to prevent rust expansion. Even the decorative elements served purposes. Carved faces on the cutwaters would show water levels, letting observers gauge flood danger. The opening ceremony drew nobility from across 3 kingdoms. This wasn't just a bridge, it was proof that the world was changing. Merchants calculated new trade routes. Military strategists considered reliable river crossings in campaign planning. The church debated whether such knowledge was divine gift or dangerous pride. James stood with the Lord as the first official crossing began. Banners flew from every arch. Musicians played from the refugees. The bishop blessed each pier, while merchants' wagons lined up, heavy with goods that would have waited months for ferry crossing. The bridge carried it all with the indifference of stone that knew its own strength. But even as crowds celebrated, James was planning the future. The engineering school needed formal structure. Standards had to be codified. The knowledge that had transformed one river crossing had to spread across a continent still struggling with Roman ruins it couldn't replicate. He'd already begun training his replacement, not one person, but a system that could outlive any individual. The master builder who'd first opposed him now ran the practical training program. The Lord's daughter who'd joined those first classes now taught mathematics to new students. The priest who'd translated that first terrifying interrogation now worked on Latin textbooks that would standardize engineering vocabulary. The revolution had begun with one man's desperate response to disaster. It would continue through countless hands, each adding refinements, pushing boundaries, building on foundations laid in those first desperate months. James had given them more than bridges. He'd given them the tools to build their own future. As twilight painted his great bridge golden, James allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. 11 people had died in the wooden bridge collapse that brought him here. Thousands would live because of what rose in its place. The arithmetic of salvation was complex, but the stones beneath his feet were simple truth. Properly applied knowledge could save lives across centuries. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The Duke's Aqueduct project, the King's summons, the 1,000 details of turning medieval craftsmen into Renaissance engineers. But tonight, James Morrison stood on a bridge between worlds, past and future, ignorance and understanding, accepting failure and demanding excellence. He'd awakened in yesterday and built tomorrow. The revolution in stone had begun. The Duke's messenger arrived at dawn, mud-splattered from hard riding, bearing a summons that would transform James Morrison's revolution from local miracle to continental transformation. 3 months had passed since the Great Bridge's completion. In that time, merchants reported trade. Efficiency doubled. No lives lost to river crossings, no seasonal isolation when wooden structures inevitably failed. The economic impact rippled outward like waves from a dropped stone, and those waves had reached the Duke of Normandy's court. "His Grace requires a builder of impossible bridges," the messenger announced in formal Latin, though his eyes showed wonder as he gazed at the triple arches soaring overhead. "He offers lands, title, and resources unlimited if you will design his new harbor." James set down the architectural drawing he'd been reviewing, plans for the Lord's new mill powered by river flow channeled through engineered races. In his time before, he might have jumped at such prestige. Now he understood that knowledge hoarded in noble courts died with its patrons. Knowledge shared in common workshops became immortal. "Tell His Grace I will come," James replied carefully. "But I travel with my teaching materials and senior students. What we build, we also teach. This is not negotiable." The messenger's eyes widened. Craftsmen didn't dictate terms to dukes, but then craftsmen didn't build bridges that laughed at floods either. He departed to carry this unprecedented response to his master, leaving James to prepare for a journey that would test whether his revolution could spread beyond one river valley. The school had grown beyond the converted warehouse. 3 buildings now housed workshops where students learned everything from basic mathematics to advanced structural analysis. The courtyard rang with hammers as apprentices shaped stone under master masons' guidance. In the design hall, young minds struggled with geometric principles that would have baffled their fathers, but would seem elementary to their children. James assembled his senior students, 12 men and 2 women who'd mastered both theory and practice. The women were controversial, but James had learned that mathematical ability cared nothing for medieval gender assumptions. Lady Margaret, the Lord's daughter who'd joined those first classes, had proven especially gifted at calculating load distributions. Her presence in the traveling party would shock the Duke's court, but shock could be educational. They departed with 3 wagons of teaching materials, models, drawings, surveying equipment James had developed, even a small library of hand-copied texts. The Lord provided guards, understanding that protecting knowledge protected his domain's growing advantage. The journey would take a week through territory where some bridges had already failed from autumn rains, while James's stone arches hadn't noticed the weather. Along the route, they stopped at every bridge, every construction site, every place where builders gathered. James gave impromptu lectures, demonstrated principles, left behind drawings, seeds of knowledge scattered wherever curiosity existed to nurture them. By the time they reached the Duke's court, word of the teaching builder had spread, faster than their wagons could roll. The Duke of Normandy was a different creature than James's rural lord, a man who thought in kingdoms rather than valleys. His court bustled with ambitions that extended across the Channel to rich English lands. But his immediate problem was local, a harbor that silted closed every winter, stranding his fleet and strangling trade. "Show me miracles, master builder," the Duke commanded after minimal courtesy. "My engineers say the harbor cannot be saved. The sea herself fights against us. Each year we dredge, each year she fills it back. Gold thrown into water would be better spent." James studied the harbor with professional eyes that had evaluated tsunami damage and earthquake resistance in another life. The problem was obvious once you understood hydraulic principles. The harbor's shape trapped sediment carried by longshore currents. Every tide brought sand and silt, but the exit channel was too narrow to flush it back out. Medieval dredging fought symptoms while ignoring causes. "Your Grace," James said carefully, using Latin refined by months of constant use, "the sea follows rules like any river. Work with those rules, and your harbor clears itself. Fight them, and you'll dredge forever." He sketched in the sand of the beach itself, showing current patterns, sediment transport, the physics of water and particles. Then he drew a solution, groins extending into the sea to interrupt longshore drift, a redesigned harbor mouth that would accelerate exit flow, training walls that would make the tides work for them rather than against. The Duke's engineers protested. Stone structures in the sea? Impossible. The waves would destroy them. The cost would bankrupt the duchy. Traditional methods might fail, but at least they failed in familiar ways. "Like your bridges failed?" the Duke asked quietly, and the engineers fell silent. James spent a month surveying, calculating, designing. But more importantly, he taught. The Duke had assembled his best builders, expecting to hoard knowledge for advantage. James turned the design process into a school. He showed why waves broke the way they did, how to calculate forces that seemed chaotic but followed mathematical laws, where to place structures to redirect rather than resist nature's power. The breakthrough came when he demonstrated with a stream table, a shallow box filled with sand where water could flow. By adjusting miniature barriers, he showed how harbor configurations either accumulated or cleared sediment. The Duke himself spent hours playing with the model, finally understanding viscerally what mathematics had been telling him abstractly. Construction began with a single groin, a finger of stone extending into waters that had never known permanent human structures. James used the same principles as bridge foundations, deep pilings, interlocking stones, shapes that shed force rather than collecting it. The workers, many of them fishermen who knew the sea's moods, initially refused to build where high tide would cover their work. James worked alongside them, showing no fear of the waves he calculated couldn't topple properly designed structures. When the first winter storm struck, everyone expected to find the groin destroyed. Instead, they found it buried in sand, exactly as James had predicted. The longshore current, interrupted, had dropped its sediment load before reaching the harbor mouth. That success broke psychological barriers. If stone could stand in the sea, what else was possible? The Duke authorized the full project. More importantly, he commanded that all work be public, all techniques be taught. He'd realized what James already knew. Shared knowledge created loyalty, stronger than secrecy created advantage. The harbor project took 2 years, but its impact was immediate. Ships that had anchored offshore, transferring cargo to small boats, now docked directly. Trade that had been seasonal became year-round. The duchy's prosperity exploded, and with it, demand for engineers who understood these new principles. But James's true innovation wasn't the harbor. It was the guild system he established with the Duke's backing. Not a medieval guild that restricted membership to preserve monopoly, but a professional organization that maintained standards while encouraging innovation. Members committed to tested principles, honest materials, regular inspection, and most importantly, teaching others. The guild's first major test came from the king himself. Word of impossible bridges and self-cleaning harbors had reached the royal court. The king wanted his capital connected by infrastructure worthy of its importance, not just bridges, but aqueducts, sewers, buildings that rose higher than tradition allowed. He summoned James with promises of wealth and threats if promises weren't fulfilled. James arrived at court with an entourage that scandalized traditionalists, students both noble and common, women, among them carrying strange instruments and speaking mathematics like a second language. They set up teaching spaces before surveying sites, making clear that building and educating were inseparable activities. The king's great bridge project dwarfed anything James had yet attempted. 7 arches spanning the kingdom's mightiest river, each arch larger than his entire first bridge. But size was just engineering. The political challenge was greater. Noble families whose lands bordered the approaches, merchant guilds who controlled current ferries, church authorities who saw prideful ambition in structures reaching toward heaven. James navigated with patience earned through experience. He designed approach ramps that enhanced rather than disrupted estates. He offered ferry operators construction positions and future toll collection rights. He incorporated chapel spaces into the bridge itself, making it a pilgrimage route as well as commercial crossing. Most cleverly, he made the bridge's construction a source of regional pride, with each district responsible for specific elements, their heraldry carved into the stones they funded. The construction site became the kingdom's greatest school. Master builders arrived skeptical and left as engineers. Young nobles who would have studied only warfare learned mathematics that applied to fortifications. Monastery scribes documented techniques, creating illustrated manuals that would spread knowledge to places James would never see. But personal life couldn't be indefinitely deferred for professional revolution. James was 45 now, successful beyond medieval imagination, but alone in ways that success couldn't address. The solution came from unexpected quarters, a widow named Eleanor who managed supply logistics for the royal project. She was that rarest of medieval creatures, a woman who ran her own business. Her late husband had been a merchant, and she'd learned his trade while he lived, then expanded it. After his death, she could calculate exchange rates in her head, speak 4 languages, and most importantly, she understood why James insisted on teaching rather than hoarding knowledge. Their courtship was conducted over supply ledgers and construction schedules. She challenged his materials estimates, forcing him to justify every expense. He showed her the mathematics behind structures, explaining why precision in supplies meant safety in buildings. They fell in love over load calculations and quantity surveys, finding in each other minds that worked in harmony. The wedding was held on the incomplete bridge itself, the first ceremony to consecrate what would become tradition. The king himself attended, along with builders from across Europe who'd come to learn. James's students formed honor guards with their surveying instruments. Eleanor's merchant contacts provided feast supplies that demonstrated the bridge's future commercial impact. Their children arrived as the bridge neared. Completion. Twins who would grow up thinking stone arches were natural phenomena, and mathematical principles were bedtime stories. James designed their house as another teaching tool, incorporating innovations that wouldn't become standard for centuries. Hypocaust heating adapted from Roman ruins, glass windows in iron frames that could withstand storms, water systems that used gravity and hydraulic principles to provide constant flow. The royal bridge's completion created a festival that lasted a week. 7 perfect arches reflected in the water below, creating circles that seemed to capture eternity in stone. The load testing had become ceremonial, war engines crossing while crowds cheered, knowing the bridge would outlast the kingdom itself. But for James, the true success was the crowd of engineers who'd built it, each now capable of creating their own miracles. Demand for guild engineers exploded beyond ability to train them. Every lord wanted bridges that wouldn't fail. Every merchant wanted warehouses that could hold previously impossible loads. Every bishop wanted churches that soared higher than tradition allowed. James found himself managing an educational empire, establishing standards and systems that could function without his constant presence. The textbook project consumed years but created permanence. Working with monastery scribes and his best students, James documented everything: principles, practices, failures as teaching tools, successes as inspiration. The books were hand-copied in dozens, then hundreds, spreading across Europe like beneficial plague. Latin translations reached Rome. Greek versions appeared in Constantinople. Even Arabic translations found their way to Cordoba's libraries, but success bred its own challenges. Unscrupulous builders claimed guild membership without training. Corners were cut in pursuit of profit. Failures were blamed on new methods rather than poor execution. The revolution's success threatened to destroy its reputation. James responded by creating the inspection system. Guild members evaluated each other's work, maintaining standards through peer review rather than authority. Published failures became teaching opportunities, showing exactly how corner cutting led to collapse. The community policed itself because everyone's reputation depended on collective excellence. Personal tragedy struck when the twins were 12. A fever swept through the capital, claiming thousands. Eleanor's merchant network meant exposure to travelers from everywhere, carriers of diseases that didn't respect social standing. She fell ill on a Tuesday, was delirious by Thursday, and died on Saturday despite everything medieval medicine could attempt. James's grief was oceanic, threatening to drown the revolution he'd built. For months, he couldn't look at calculations without seeing her corrections in the margins. Every successful project felt hollow without her pride in their shared accomplishment. The twins, brilliant mirrors of both parents, were his only anchor to purpose. He channeled grief into legacy. The Eleanor Foundation was established to educate promising students regardless of birth or gender. Her belief that knowledge should flow like water became institutional principle. The foundation's schools spread across the kingdom, each teaching mathematics and engineering alongside traditional subjects. The twins grew into their inheritance, both intellectual and financial. The boy, Robert, pushed mathematical theory beyond his father's practical applications, developing calculations for forces James had only estimated. The girl, Marie, applied engineering principles to new fields, designing looms that multiplied textile production and mills that ground grain with unprecedented efficiency. By age 60, James had become legend. The foreign builder who'd appeared from nowhere had transformed European infrastructure. Bridges that had failed seasonally now stood permanently. Harbors that had required constant dredging now maintained themselves. Buildings rose to heights that had seemed impossible, their stone skeletons carrying loads that would have crushed traditional construction. But the final challenge came from nature itself. The Great Storm of 1347, a hurricane-strength tempest that would be recorded in every chronicle, struck the coast with unprecedented fury. Storm surge swept miles inland, winds toppled thousand-year oaks, rain fell in sheets that turned streams to torrents and rivers to moving lakes. When the storm cleared, the devastation was absolute. Except where new engineering had been applied, every traditional bridge for 300 miles had vanished. Stone buildings had become rubble. The old harbor designs were choked with wreckage. But James's bridges stood. The Duke's engineered harbor had actually deepened, scoured clean by redirected currents. Buildings designed with proper load distribution had shed wind instead of catching it. The contrast was so stark that even the most conservative traditionalists couldn't argue. In a single storm, centuries of resistance to change were swept away, along with failed infrastructure. Kings and bishops, merchants and farmers all saw the same truth. Proper engineering was the difference between civilization and catastrophe. James spent his final years on what would be his masterpiece, not a single structure, but a network. He designed systems of bridges, roads, and canals that would unite fractured kingdoms through infrastructure. Each element supported the others, creating resilience through redundancy. When one bridge needed repair, alternate routes existed. When storms threatened, flood management systems protected entire regions rather than single towns. The vision required cooperation beyond medieval precedent. Multiple kingdoms had to coordinate. Noble rivalries had to be set aside. The church had to bless what some still called unnatural knowledge, but the economic arguments were overwhelming. Regions connected by reliable infrastructure prospered. Those clinging to tradition faced exodus as people migrated toward opportunity. James lived to see the first segments completed. Trade routes that had taken weeks now took days. Cities that had been isolated became centers of commerce. The medieval world was transforming into something new, connected by stone and iron, and most importantly, by shared knowledge of how to build. His death came peacefully at 72, surrounded by students who'd become masters, grandchildren who'd never known a world without soaring arches, and drawings for projects that would take decades to complete. His last coherent words were instructions about thermal expansion in iron fixtures, teaching until breath failed, connecting tomorrow's problems to today's solutions. The funeral became a continental event. Every bridge was decorated with banners. Engineering schools held moments of silence that were immediately followed by intensive classes, the tribute James would have preferred. Kings and commoners alike spoke of transformation, of the foreign master who'd rebuilt their world, one calculated stone at a time. But true memorial wasn't ceremony. It was continuation. Marie Morrison established the Grand Academy, centralizing advanced engineering education. Robert Morrison pushed mathematical boundaries, developing theories that would later be discovered by names history would remember. The grandchildren carried revolution into new fields: hydraulics, mechanics, optics, applying principles their grandfather had introduced. A century later, what historians would call the early Renaissance bloomed across Europe, its foundations literally built on James Morrison's arches. Cathedrals soared to heights medieval builders had thought blasphemous. Cities expanded beyond walls, connected by infrastructure that made siege warfare obsolete. Ships designed with mathematical precision crossed oceans, carrying European engineering to worlds that would be transformed in turn. Scholars debated the pivot point. When had medieval acceptance of failure transformed into modern demand for excellence? They identified various moments: the first stone arch rising from wooden centering, the harbor that cleaned itself, the storm that destroyed everything except proper engineering. But those who understood recognized the true transformation was quieter, the moment when knowledge became more valuable, shared than hoarded. In university libraries, James's textbooks were still copied, their principles sound though their language was archaic. Students learned the Morrison method: observe, calculate, test, teach. Engineering ethics courses used his guild standards as foundation for professional responsibility. His insistence that builders be educators had created a self-improving system that advanced beyond what any individual could achieve. The bridges themselves stood as testament. The original arch over the small stream had become a pilgrimage site, its modest span representing impossible made routine. The great royal bridge carried traffic that would have crushed its wooden predecessors, its stones worn smooth by millions of crossings, but structurally sound as the day they were placed. Each arch was a word in an argument written in stone. Humans could build forever if they understood how. But perhaps the truest legacy was expectation. Medieval acceptance that bridges fell, harbors silted, buildings collapsed, had been replaced by demand for permanence. When structures failed, investigations sought causes rather than accepting divine will. Engineering became a profession with standards, responsibilities, and most importantly, the obligation to teach what was learned. James Morrison had awakened from tomorrow into yesterday and chosen to rebuild rather than despair. He'd found medieval humanity struggling with problems that had solutions. If only someone would teach them, he'd built bridges between ignorance and understanding, spanning gulfs wider than any river. The revolution in stone had become revolution in thinking. In the end, he'd been time's own engineer, designing connections between what was and what could be. He'd taken medieval foundations and constructed Renaissance possibilities. He'd shown that progress wasn't about when you lived, but how you thought, what you taught, whom you lifted. The architect from tomorrow had rebuilt yesterday, one perfectly calculated stone at a time. The students of his students would continue building, pushing boundaries he'd established, reaching heights he'd made possible. They would discover principles he'd only intuited, create materials he'd only dreamed of, solve problems he couldn't imagine. But they would build on foundations he'd laid, not just stone and mortar, but the bedrock belief that knowledge shared was humanity's greatest tool. Time's river flowed on, but the bridges James Morrison built across it would stand forever, not just the physical spans of stone, but the connections between human potential and achievement. He'd crossed from future to past and ensured the future would arrive sooner, built on arches that could bear any load. The revolution was complete, not when the last stone was placed, but when the first student understood why it would stand forever. In teaching medieval minds to think like engineers, James had engineered the greatest bridge of all, the one that carried humanity from accepting failure to demanding excellence. Thanks for watching this incredible story of engineering revolution that transformed the medieval world through the power of shared knowledge. If you enjoyed seeing how one architect's expertise rebuilt civilization from the ground up, creating bridges and buildings that would stand for centuries, make sure to like and subscribe. Click on the story on your screen now for another amazing tale of time-traveling innovation that will absolutely blow your mind.